Welcome back. There is a live look outside from the Oregon coast. A beautiful view there from our In Its Spanish Head resort hotel camera in Lincoln City. Thanks for watching Afternoon Live. Our next guest was shocked to learn that a childhood friend who was an academic star from an upper middle class family had been homeless for decades. His latest book explores that story and their relationship. We welcome the author of Anything is Good, Fred Waitzkin. Thank you so much for joining us, Fred.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Tell me a little bit about this book, because it's presented as a novel, but the central character is your real buddy, Ralph, who you were best friends with back in high school.
Yeah, well, you know, my last three books that were novels all start with a true story. And a lot of great books have the basis in reality, and then they sort of wander into fiction. Like, for example, if you think about The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, a lot of people think, wow, what a great story. But they don't realize that 15 years earlier, he wrote that story as a two-page article for the Toronto Star. So, you know, I like to do that too. I like to take a real story and then take it to strange places.
For sure. So tell us a little bit about Ralph's backstory. He was just a brilliant kid. He had kind of a complicated family life.
Yeah, I mean, crazy family life. He was my best friend in high school, and I knew very little about his family life. I mean, most of our friendship took place in my house. My mom used to take us to hear jazz. We went to see movies. You know, I thought he was a great guy, but he didn't like sports and wasn't interested in girls particularly. And at one point he said to me, you know, Fred, I'm an alien. I thought, wow, I have a friend that's an alien. I guess I was a little offbeat myself. So the idea of having a friend that was an alien was really cool. But Ralph, for his whole life, needed to sort of like translate between his own sensibility and whomever he was speaking with, because he really did come from a strange place. After we finished high school, Ralph went to college in the Midwest, and he was immediately recognized as a genius in philosophy. He hung out with some of the top philosophers in the world, actually. And when he finished college, he started his PhD, but he found it too slow moving, so he moved into an apartment that was paid for by his dad, kind of fancy apartment on the Upper East Side, where he could do his inventing and his philosophy. Ralph's father, meanwhile, was living a subterranean life. He had a second wife. He was a bigamist. He had bought the house of Errol Flynn, movie actor, and he was living there with his new wife and a bunch of kids. And Ralph didn't know about this. I mean, he was up in his apartment inventing things. But eventually, the father's business started to fall apart. And when the business fell apart, Ralph's sister, who looked out for Ralph, moved him into a tiny little room in the house of a cousin in Miami Beach. And it was just big enough for his computer and a tiny bed. But the cousin thought that Ralph was crazy. He thought maybe he was doing spy work with his computer, because the computers were not that regular at those times. They were rare. So one day, he was furious with Ralph, and he grabbed him by the collar, and he threw him out onto the street. Ralph had no shoes. He had only a few cents in his pocket, and his glasses were broken. And then Ralph lived on the street for the next 20 years.
So he would check in with you occasionally, right? Call you, collect from a payphone, and you'd be relieved to hear from him and know that he was at least okay for now?
Yeah, we would speak on the phone, but I was really very impatient with the idea that he was a street guy. I knew he was the smartest guy in town, or in many towns, and I didn't understand what he was doing living on the street. And so his life was really a mystery to me. But when I got in touch with him many years later, and I started to ask him about what happened during this 20-year period of time where he disappeared, he told me one of the most amazing stories that I ever heard in my life. I mean, it just blew my mind. That's Ralph. That's Ralph when he was homeless in Florida. And it was a great book to write. It was a painterly thing to write, because on the one hand, you had the glamour of Miami Beach, these beautiful hotels, beautiful cars, beautiful swimming pools. And the other hand, right across the street, literally right across the street, was this park where these homeless people were living in squalor. But what I learned a great deal about Ralph once we started talking about it. And I realized, 20 years later, I started talking about it with him, and I realized he told me this amazing story. I had to write about it. And he told me he opened up the world of homeless people to me. He explained to me that homeless people weren't what I thought. I mean, I live in New York and I see homeless people living on the sidewalk, and I sort of take them for granted. I don't think that they're sensitive or intelligent or they live a regular life. I just think that they're kind of like pathetic. But what Ralph discovered living on the street for 20 years was that many of them are brilliant. Many of them are creative. Some of them like music. Some of them write. And Ralph himself grew into, during this homeless period of time, became a kind of lay therapist. And because he was a brilliant guy. And so a lot of people that were homeless on the streets would come over to him and they would ask him about their problems, and he would give them comfort, try to suggest to them that maybe someday they can get off the street. And so he was living a very creative life as a homeless person, particularly during the last years of his homeless life.
It is quite fascinating. So tell me about your creative process in writing this book. Did you do anything differently or in a new way that differs from your previous work?
That was a great question. I'll tell you, I did something that I'd never dreamed of before. I didn't know how to end the book. I mean, I knew I had a great story, the story of this guy that lives, in terrible circumstances and just barely stays alive, starving half the time. But I didn't know how to end the book. And one night, laying in my bed in New York, I went to sleep and I woke up and I had a dream. And I turned around and I scribbled the dream on a pad of paper. And the next 4 months, every night I had a dream. And I scribbled it on a piece of paper and went to my office on 28th Street and wrote it up. And that's how I conceived of the ending. The ending is kind of amazing. Do I have another minute to tell you something about it?
Real quick, if you can get us there really quickly, you can.
Ralph falls in love with a young Chinese girl. And he has an idea that to live a beautiful life with her, they should move to Pompano Beach, which is 30 miles to the north. And they get to Pompano and they walk out and they find a fishing pier. Fishing pier goes out into the ocean and poor people fish on the pier to fish. But the fishing pier is filthy. It's got rotting crabs and snakes and feral cats. It's really a terrible place to live. But they have such a beautiful life together and they care for each other so much that this beautiful life, this awful life becomes a beautiful life. And that's where the title came from. Anything is good.
That's a beautiful story. Hey, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Of course. The book again is Anything is Good by Fred Waitzkin. We'll have more information on our website at katu.com. We'll be right back with more Afternoon Live right after this.